The first cold wind of December moved softly through the neighborhood, carrying with it the smell of pine, cinnamon, and warm cookies. Strings of glowing lights hung from rooftops, wreaths decorated every door, and inflatable snowmen waved from front lawns. It was the time of year when everything felt warm even when the air was freezing. People walked slower in the evenings just to take in the sights. Families sat in their cars with the windows slightly open, letting their children point at the lights and whisper in excitement. Among all the houses on that street, one home stood out. It wasn't because it was loud or tacky. It was beautiful. The homeowner had spent weeks planning it. Every light was carefully placed, every color balanced, every wire hidden from view. White and gold lights wrapped around the trees like threads of starlight. The roof glittered softly like snow in moonlight. A quiet melody played from small speakers hidden in the bushes, a soft instrumental tune that made everyone feel calm and happy. People from nearby blocks even started coming by just to see the display. Children pressed their faces against car windows to catch every glowing detail. It was a scene that made the street feel alive, as if the holiday spirit itself had moved into the neighborhood. But then, everything changed with a single piece of paper. It was a quiet night. The house stood glowing like a lantern in the cold darkness. The man stood outside with a mug of hot chocolate in his hand, proud of what he had built. He wasn't trying to be better than anyone. He just wanted to bring a little light into the world. That's when he saw the envelope sitting in his mailbox. It was plain white, but the return address was enough to freeze the warmth from the air. HOA, Homeowners Association. He opened the envelope slowly, the paper stiff and official. The words inside were short, cold, and sharp. Your holiday light display is in violation of neighborhood standards. You are required to remove all decorations within 48 hours or face daily fines. There was no greeting, no explanation, no kindness, just a command. He stood under the glowing lights with the letter in his hand, the cold wind biting at his cheeks. His heart, which had been full of quiet joy, now tightened like a clenched fist. His lights weren't hurting anyone. The neighbors loved them. Kids loved them. But the HOA didn't care. They saw it as a violation, not a celebration. He looked around the street. Other houses had decorations too, but none as bright or carefully done as his. And somehow, only he had received a letter. That told him everything. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. About power. About someone deciding what joy should look like. He crumpled the letter in his fist but didn't throw it away. Not yet. He went inside, sat at his kitchen table, and read the letter again and again. The language was cold and legal, like it had been written by someone who had forgotten what holidays even felt like. Daily fines. Threats. No discussion. No appeal. It was designed to make him surrender quietly. But surrender wasn't something he was good at. Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the windows. But the lights still shone brightly, defying the dark. As he stared through the glass at the glowing scene he had created, a quiet resolve settled in his chest. He wasn't taking anything down. Not because of pride, but because something deep inside him refused to let a group of people with clipboards and bad tempers decide how his home should feel. 2 hours later, as the rest of the neighborhood slept, an HOA patrol car slowed down in front of his house. A woman with a flashlight stepped out, took photos of the lights, and wrote something down on a clipboard. She didn't knock. She didn't say anything. She just watched the house like it was a crime scene. He saw her from the window, the glow of the lights shining against her disapproving face. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn off the lights. He just stood there, watching him, until she drove away. The next morning, another letter appeared in his mailbox. This one was even colder. Failure to comply will result in immediate fines and possible legal action. No signature. No name. Just the cold hand of a faceless HOA. Word spread through the neighborhood fast. Some neighbors whispered that he should just take the lights down to avoid trouble. Others shook their heads and said the HOA had gone too far. One woman told him her kids looked forward to passing his house every night after dinner. Another man patted him on the back and said, "Don't let them win." But fear was a strange thing. While many supported him quietly, few were willing to stand with him openly. No one wanted the HOA to turn on them next. That night, as he walked down the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, he noticed the little things. The way people peeked through their curtains. The way some lights were dimmer than before, as if people were already trying to stay invisible. The HOA ruled the neighborhood like a shadow. He reached the end of the driveway and looked back at his house. The lights shone even brighter against the dark. He imagined some of the board members sitting in their houses, frowning, waiting for him to give in. But he wouldn't. As the clock struck midnight, he pulled up his phone and started looking up HOA bylaws. If they wanted to play their game, then he would learn the rules better than they did. Line by line, he read through endless legal language. He discovered something interesting. His lights didn't technically break any rule. The letter they sent was vague on purpose, just intimidation to make him comply. And that made his blood run hot, not with fear, but with anger. He didn't just want to keep his lights. He wanted to make sure the HOA learned they couldn't control everyone with threats. 2 days passed, and the HOA grew louder. More letters, more photos, more warnings. But each night, his house remained lit. People began to stop their cars and honk in support. A few even put up brighter decorations of their own. Quiet resistance was growing, and the HOA didn't like it. On the third day, a formal notice arrived on thick paper with an embossed seal. They were calling him to a disciplinary hearing at the community center. It was written like a court summons, heavy and official, meant to scare him. He read it slowly, then folded it neatly. They wanted a fight. They were about to get one. That night, as the neighborhood grew quiet and the cold settled over the roofs like a heavy blanket, he stood under the glowing lights one more time. The wires hummed softly. The warm colors painted the snow on the ground. The HOA thought they could scare him into darkness. But all they had done was give him a reason to shine brighter. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn blew softly in the night. And in that quiet moment, he made up his mind. He wouldn't just defend his lights. He would make sure the HOA regretted ever trying to silence them. What they didn't know was that he wasn't just an ordinary homeowner. He was patient. He was smart. And once he started planning, he didn't stop until he won. This was no longer about decorations. This was about standing up to a power that had gotten too comfortable. He turned away from the lights and walked back inside, the door closing behind him with a quiet click. But outside, the house continued to glow like a beacon. The warning they had sent him had done the opposite of what they intended. They had lit a fire they couldn't put out. The next morning the cold air carried a strange stillness over the neighborhood, like the calm before something heavy. The sun rose slowly, its pale winter light glinting off the frozen rooftops and the glittering lights wrapped around his house. But he didn't have time to admire it. He was already standing outside the HOA office, a small beige building at the end of the street that looked harmless from the outside but was known in the neighborhood as the place where happiness went to die. He pushed open the door and walked in, the warm air smelling faintly of old carpet and printer ink. Inside, the walls were covered with framed rules and notices. Every poster had the same cold tone: compliance required. Violations will be fined. There wasn't a single sign that spoke of community or joy. A woman sat behind the front desk with a stiff smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked up at him as if she had been waiting. "Can I help you?" she asked in a voice as flat as the paper stacked next to her. He placed the letter they had sent him on the counter. "Yeah, you can start by explaining this." Her eyes flicked to the paper. Her smile didn't move. "Holiday light violation," she said casually, as if she was talking about a parking ticket. "You've been given 48 hours to comply. Otherwise, daily fines will apply." "Comply?" he repeated slowly. "For what? My lights are no brighter than the others. I walked the entire street last night. I'm not the only one with decorations." The woman didn't even blink. "We decide which decorations are appropriate. Yours are excessive. It's been reported." He felt a wave of heat rise in his chest. "Reported by who?" "That information is confidential," she replied smoothly. He leaned forward slightly, not aggressively but with enough weight in his voice to make her flinch just a little. You know what's funny? You keep saying we like this is some fair, balanced process. But it's not. Someone complained. And instead of checking anything, you just decided to drop threats on my doorstep. The woman gave a small shrug, as if none of it mattered. The board made the decision. If you have a problem, you can attend the next board meeting. But that won't stop the fines from starting if you don't remove the decorations. Her words were calm, but the smug tone beneath them was loud. He picked up the letter, folded it neatly, and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. He looked her straight in the eyes and said quietly, "Then I guess I'll see the board." As he walked out, he noticed something that made his jaw tighten. A man standing outside was taking photos of his house from across the street with a long camera lens. He wasn't even subtle about it. It was one of the HOA's so-called volunteers, a neighbor who loved enforcing rules more than living. The man lowered his camera when their eyes met, but he didn't stop. He just smiled like someone who thought he was untouchable. That smile was burned into his mind as he walked home. By the time he returned to his driveway, there was another note taped to his front door. It was short, typed, and without a name at the bottom. We strongly advise immediate compliance. Further violation will result in escalated action. He stared at the paper for a long time before pulling it down slowly. He could feel the cold wind hitting his face, the same coldness he saw in the HOA's behavior. It wasn't just about lights. They were trying to make an example out of him. That afternoon, neighbors started whispering. Some avoided him, lowering their heads when they walked past. Others gave small nods of support, too afraid to say anything aloud. One older woman, wrapped in a thick red scarf, leaned close and whispered, "Don't let them bully you. They tried the same thing on us last year." She hurried away before anyone saw her talking to him. Another man, standing at the end of the sidewalk, said quietly, "Careful, they'll watch everything you do now." And indeed they were. Over the next few days, HOA volunteers drove by slowly, taking pictures and writing things on their clipboards. It felt less like a neighborhood and more like living under surveillance. He pretended not to care, but inside, a fire was growing. He began to watch them back. Every time they parked across the street, he stood on his porch and stared straight at them. They didn't like being watched. They wanted him to feel small. Instead, he made them feel seen. 3 days later, he received the formal notice summoning him to the HOA board meeting. It was written in their usual stiff tone, but one line stood out: "Failure to resolve this matter may result in legal escalation." They thought the word legal would scare him. It didn't. It just told him they were confident he would break. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. When the night of the meeting came, he arrived at the HOA office early. The board sat behind a long table, 5 members lined up like judges in a courtroom. The president sat in the center, a woman with thin lips and sharp eyes that seemed to judge everything they saw. She wore a perfect blazer and an even more perfect fake smile. "You've been summoned to address your violation," she said, her voice dripping with practiced authority. "Your decorations are a disruption to the community's visual harmony." He let out a quiet laugh. "Visual harmony? That's a new one. Funny how nobody else got a letter when their decorations are up too." "Your lights are excessive," she repeated, her jaw tightening. "It's against our standards." "Show me the standard," he said flatly. That made her pause for just a second. Then she opened a folder and started flipping pages. Nothing she read said anything about brightness levels, music volume, or size of displays. The language was vague. It was meant to be vague. It gave them power to target whoever they wanted. He leaned forward and said quietly, "You don't like my house. That's fine. But don't pretend this is about rules. This is about control. You're hoping I'll roll over like everyone else. But I won't." The room went quiet. A few board members exchanged looks. The president forced a thin smile. "If you don't comply," she said softly, "we'll fine you every day until you do. And eventually, we'll take it further." He didn't blink. "Do your worst," he said, standing up. But I promise you this, you'll regret making me your problem. The president's smile faltered for the briefest second. He walked out of the meeting without another word, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. But instead of fear, there was something sharp in his chest. It wasn't just defiance now. It was a plan starting to take shape. The HOA thought they had backed him into a corner. But all they had done was give him a reason to fight smarter. From that night on, they weren't just dealing with a homeowner. They were dealing with someone who had nothing to lose and a sharp mind full of ideas. And before this was over, their precious little HOA meeting would never be the same again. The days that followed the HOA hearing changed everything in the neighborhood. What had started as a simple letter over holiday lights had now grown into a silent war. People who had once smiled casually at each other now watched from behind curtains. Conversations that used to happen on driveways had turned into whispers at doorsteps. Everyone was talking about what happened at the HOA meeting. Word had spread faster than the winter wind. The homeowner hadn't backed down. He had stood in front of the board, stared down the president, and walked away without giving an inch. That alone had shaken the balance of power. Most people in that neighborhood had learned to keep their heads down. When the HOA gave orders, they obeyed. It wasn't because they agreed with everything. It was because they didn't want to be the next target. But seeing someone finally stand up to them, that changed the air. That night, he walked through the neighborhood slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, his breath fogging in the cold air. Christmas lights glowed faintly on the other houses, but something felt different. More than a few homes had dimmed their lights or taken some decorations down, afraid of the HOA turning on them next. But some had added more lights. A few bright strands on a tree, a glowing wreath here, a snowflake projector there. It wasn't much, but it was quiet defiance. He saw it. He felt it. And he knew the HOA saw it too. The next morning, an HOA vehicle rolled through the neighborhood, stopping in front of houses, taking photos, scribbling on clipboards. The volunteers wore the same smug expressions, like self-appointed sheriffs patrolling their land. But this time, people weren't pretending not to notice. A couple of neighbors stood on their porches, arms crossed, watching. Silent, yes, but not afraid. He felt something stir deep inside. For the first time, the power the HOA held over everyone didn't seem so absolute. Still, the board wasn't going to back down easily. 2 days later, another letter arrived. It wasn't just another threat. This one had a long list of made-up violations. Improper lighting placement. Unauthorized fixtures. Excessive brightness. He laughed when he read it. They were grasping at straws now. They wanted to overwhelm him with noise, bury him under paper, force him to give up. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. That night, he printed the HOA bylaws again, line by line, highlighting every vague rule, every weakness, every place where their so-called authority fell apart under real scrutiny. Their entire system was built on fear, not strength. And fear only worked when people believed in it. He wasn't going to believe anymore. He knew what the HOA didn't. If they were going to try and embarrass him, he could make them choke on their own rules. While he was reading, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his neighbors, a man named Jeff who lived 2 houses down. Jeff wasn't the type to get involved in anything. But now, his message was simple. They're going too far. You're not the only one tired of this. Then came another message. A woman from across the street. If you're doing something, count us in. It wasn't an army, but it was the start of something. The next day, when the HOA patrol came back, they weren't greeted with silence anymore. A few neighbors stood together on the sidewalks, arms folded, watching every move they made. The volunteers didn't like it. They were used to walking around with no pushback. But now, every camera click felt like it was being recorded in return. The HOA president sent out a neighborhood-wide email that afternoon. It was long and dripping with fake politeness. She reminded everyone about the importance of uniformity and the beauty of shared standards. But buried beneath her careful words was a warning. She named him directly as an example of someone endangering community harmony. He read the email twice. Instead of making him angry, it made him smile. They were trying to isolate him. They didn't realize they were giving him a spotlight. By the evening, people were talking even more. Some were still nervous. Others were tired of the HOA controlling everything from fence colors to how many lights they could hang. One neighbor came over with coffee and said quietly, "You know, years ago they made me take down a small flag I had on my porch. I didn't fight back. I should have." Another whispered, "We've all had run-ins with them. Everyone's just been scared." He listened carefully. Every word was proof that the HOA's power wasn't as strong as it looked. It was built on people staying quiet. If even a few stopped being quiet, their control would crack. By the end of the week, the neighborhood was divided into two groups. On one side were the silent loyalists, the ones who nodded along with the HOA, hoping they'd be spared. On the other were the quiet rebels, neighbors who were done being told what they could or couldn't do on their own property. The board could feel it. Their patrols got harsher. The letters became more frequent. But the more they pushed, the more it backfired. Families started stringing up more lights. Not huge displays, just enough to make a point. The neighborhood was starting to glow brighter, and it wasn't just because of decorations. It was Defiance. And in the middle of it all was him, the man they had tried to break first. One evening, as he walked past the community center, he saw the HOA board members inside, talking fast, waving papers, looking angry. They weren't as calm as they pretended to be in their emails. They were nervous. That made him smile. They thought this was about lights. They had no idea what was coming. He stood under the streetlight that night, the cold air stinging his skin, and he made himself a promise. He wasn't just going to win. He was going to make sure the entire neighborhood saw them for what they really were. And once they did, the HOA would never have that kind of power again. What started as a letter in a mailbox had now grown into something bigger. This wasn't just a fight over holiday lights anymore. This was a spark that could burn down their control. And he was ready to be the one who lit the fire late that night. The house stood silent except for the soft hum of the holiday lights outside, glowing against the cold air like warm embers. Inside, the living room was dim, and he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. Stacks of papers, HOA emails, printed bylaws, and photographs of their so-called violations were spread out like the pieces of a puzzle. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked focused. For the first time, this wasn't just about defending himself. It was about striking back. The HOA thought they were clever. They thought they could intimidate him with threats and hide behind vague rules. But they had made one big mistake. They'd underestimated him. Slowly, methodically, he went through every line of the HOA's rules, every event they had planned for the month. And then he saw it. Right there on the event calendar, printed in bold letters, HOA Annual Winter Meeting, Community Hall, 7 p.m., December 18th. That meeting wasn't just a gathering. It was the most important night of the year for them. It was where they showed off their control. Fancy decorations, speeches from the president, and a show of power in front of the entire neighborhood. People usually showed up bored, signed some papers, and left, but it was their night. And that was exactly why it was perfect. A slow grin crossed his face. If they wanted to embarrass him, he would flip the board right under their feet. He didn't want a fight on their terms anymore. He wanted one on his. The idea began small but grew with every passing minute. He could already imagine it. The room filled with board members, the president standing on stage with that fake smile, and then the moment everything changed. If they could weaponize their rules, so could he. If they could use the community as a stage to humiliate him, then that same stage would be the place where he destroyed their perfect little image. He opened his laptop and started searching. Stage lighting rentals, laser equipment, portable projectors, holiday show gear. Everything he needed to turn their boring annual meeting into something they would never forget. He sent a few quiet messages to the neighbors who had supported him. Not all of them, just the ones he knew wouldn't panic. Their replies came fast. "I'm in. Whatever you need, I'll help." They've had this coming for years. Some even offered their own equipment, decorations, extension cords, music systems, even a snow machine one family kept in their garage from a winter festival. This was no longer one man against the board. It was starting to look like the neighborhood itself was preparing to strike back. The next day, while the HOA president and her volunteers paraded through the neighborhood sending warning letters to people who dared to add more lights, he quietly started gathering his tools. He drove to a rental shop in the next town over and picked up professional-grade laser light rigs, small enough to move but powerful enough to light up the entire community hall like a stage show. He talked to the owner of the shop with a calm smile and paid in cash, not wanting anything to tip off the HOA early. Over the next few days, he prepared in silence. While the HOA kept piling up letters on his doorstep, believing they were pushing him into a corner, he was preparing the floor beneath their feet to collapse. The community hall was easy to access. He knew that from the times he'd gone to those dull meetings in the past. The back door had a maintenance entrance that nobody ever locked properly. Late at night, when the street was quiet, he and Jeff quietly slipped inside to take measurements. They planned where to place the lasers, where to set up the lights, and how to run the power without tripping the hall's breakers. Every detail was precise. Every move calculated. This wasn't just about putting on a show. This was about making it unforgettable. Meanwhile, the HOA grew bolder. More notices. More threats. More smug emails from the president telling him that his continued defiance would not be tolerated. She clearly believed she was winning. In her mind, he was just a stubborn homeowner about to cave. She had no idea she was walking straight into his trap. On the night before the meeting, he went over the plan one more time. The neighbors who had joined him gathered in his garage, their faces serious but excited. For years they had felt powerless against the board. But now, for the first time, they were part of something that actually pushed back. One woman, a quiet resident who had lived in the neighborhood for more than a decade, whispered, "Do you realize how long we've all waited to see them fall?" Another man, grinning as he helped coil the cables, said, "They'll never see it coming." He didn't need to give speeches. He just nodded. They all knew exactly what they were about to do. Outside, the night was freezing. The cold wind bit at their faces, but it felt good. Sharp. Real. He stood in his driveway for a long moment, staring at the glowing lights on his house. Those same lights the HOA had tried to crush. Tomorrow, they would shine brighter than ever, but not here. They would shine in the one place the HOA thought belonged to them. The community hall. Their stage. Their pride. And when it happened, they wouldn't be able to silence it. They had started this fight thinking they were dealing with someone they could bully into silence. But what they had created instead was a storm waiting to strike. As he locked up the garage and headed inside, a strange calm washed over him. Tomorrow night wouldn't just be a meeting. It would be the moment the neighborhood saw who really had power. Not the board. Not the president. But the people they had been trying to control all along. And when that light show began, their precious authority would shatter like glass under a hammer. The morning of the annual HOA meeting arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning where the air bites your lungs and the frost clings to rooftops like a warning. But he didn't feel the chill. He was awake before sunrise, moving through his house in silence like a man with a mission. The smell of strong coffee filled the kitchen, but he barely drank it. His mind was already deep inside the plan. The HOA thought tonight would be their victory lap. They imagined him walking into that meeting defeated, humiliated, maybe ready to finally take his lights down. They believed they had already won. But they didn't know what was waiting for them inside their own hall. He spent the day moving like a shadow. The equipment was already in place. The previous night, with Jeff and two other neighbors, they had quietly slipped into the community hall through the maintenance door. The lasers, projectors, and extension cords were carefully hidden behind the heavy red curtains on the stage. The lights were tucked into the rafters, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. One power switch, hidden behind the storage rack, was all it would take to unleash the entire spectacle. He checked everything twice, then 3 times, running through the sequence in his head until every step felt like muscle memory. While the HOA board spent the afternoon bragging in emails about how important tonight's meeting will be for community standards, he was smiling quietly in his garage. tightening the last cable. Outside, the neighborhood felt tense. Cars slowed as they passed his house, neighbors giving him nods, some whispered words of encouragement. They didn't ask for details, but their eyes said enough. Everyone knew something was going to happen. They just didn't know what. By evening, the sun had fallen behind the trees, and the cold had turned sharper. The streetlights came on one by one, painting the road in a pale glow. He put on his jacket, zipped it up slowly, and walked outside. His house was still covered in lights, bright, warm, and beautiful. But tonight, those lights weren't the real battle. The war would be fought in the community hall. He walked toward it with steady steps, his boots crunching against the frosted ground. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't even angry anymore. He was ready. When he arrived, the parking lot was already filling up. People were walking in groups, some chatting nervously, others quiet, curious. The HOA had decorated the front of the hall with boring white lights and dull banners that said annual meeting in stiff black letters. It looked nothing like the warm holiday spirit outside his home. The board members stood near the entrance, wearing their perfect smiles like masks. The president spotted him the second he approached. Her lips curved into that smug grin that had haunted so many neighbors for years. "I'm glad you decided to attend," she said sweetly, though her voice carried the sharpness of a knife. "This is, after all, the night we clear up your little situation." He met her eyes and didn't flinch. "Oh," he said calmly, "I wouldn't miss this for the world." She didn't know what to do with that answer, so she just tilted her head and gave a small laugh, the kind of laugh people give when they think they've already won. Inside, the hall was filling fast. Rows of metal chairs were lined up facing the small stage where the board usually gave their speeches. A few volunteers handed out copies of the agenda, and at the top of the list was his name. They weren't even trying to hide it. They planned to make an example out of him in front of everyone. But tonight, the example wasn't going to be what they expected. Jeff gave him a slight nod from the back row. Two other neighbors were positioned near the side doors, ready for the signal. Everything was in place. The HOA president took the stage first, tapping the microphone like she always did, pretending she was a queen giving a speech to her subjects. "Welcome, everyone," she said in her sugary, fake voice. "Tonight is a very important night. We're here to address violations, discuss neighborhood harmony, and make sure everyone understands our shared standards." The board members behind her nodded along like puppets. The crowd, however, was restless. Whispers filled the air. Everyone knew what was coming. She stretched the moment out, loving the spotlight, loving the power. "And now," she said dramatically, "I want to address the most disruptive situation we've had in years." She didn't get to finish the sentence. He raised his hand. Calm, steady, deliberate. "Before you do," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the room, "I think it's only fair that everyone here gets a real taste of what you're trying to silence." A few people in the crowd murmured. The president blinked, surprised by the interruption. "This is not your platform," she snapped. "You'll have your—" He pressed the button in his pocket. A soft click. Then silence. And then, the lights in the hall dimmed. A low hum filled the air. People turned their heads, confused at first. Then the curtains on the stage exploded with color. Beams of red, green, and gold shot across the ceiling like fireworks. Snowflake patterns danced across the walls. The lasers painted the room in swirling waves of light, synchronized perfectly with a soft, elegant holiday melody that echoed through the hall speakers. Gasps filled the room. Children in the front row laughed in awe. Even some of the board members looked around in shock. It wasn't messy or loud. It was beautiful. It was the very thing they had tried so hard to destroy, right here, in their most important meeting of the year. The president's face drained of color. She stumbled toward the microphone. "Turn it off," she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the music and the growing applause. The neighbors who had been too afraid to speak were now clapping, cheering, even whistling. The volunteers at the back looked at each other, unsure what to do. The board had been blindsided. Everything they had built their power on, fear, silence, control, was cracking right in front of them. The show continued, not with chaos but with precision. Every beam of light hit the ceiling exactly as planned. The holiday melody grew louder, warm and bright, wrapping the entire room in something the HOA could never manufacture: real joy. One of the neighbors whispered loudly, "This is what the neighborhood should feel like." Another added, "He did this better than they ever could." The president's face twisted with rage, but she couldn't stop it. She had lost control of the room. This wasn't her meeting anymore. It belonged to the people. And as he stood at the back, hands in his pockets, watching the colors reflect off the walls, he knew this was only the beginning of their downfall. They had tried to silence his light. Instead, he had made sure it was shining on them. The moment the light show filled the community hall, the entire room changed. The HOA president, who just seconds earlier had been standing tall with her fake smile and perfect posture, suddenly looked like someone standing in the middle of a storm she couldn't control. The beams of color painted the walls with snowflakes, stars, and spirals of light. The music rose softly, the kind that made people smile without even realizing it. And that was the moment the shift happened. 4 years, these meetings had been the board stage. Every December, the HOA spoke down to the residents from the front of the room like kings lecturing their subjects. Nobody ever interrupted them. Nobody ever dared to make them look weak. But tonight, they were no longer in control. The neighbors who usually sat quiet in their seats began clapping, cheering, laughing. Kids jumped up from their chairs, waving their hands under the moving lights, their faces glowing with excitement. It wasn't a meeting anymore. It was a celebration. And the best part was that there was nothing the HOA could do to stop it. The president slammed her hands on the podium, shouting over the music. "Turn it off. Turn this off right now," she screamed. But her voice was just a weak noise against the joyful sound of the music and the laser beams cutting across the ceiling. She turned to the board members sitting behind her, but none of them moved. Some were too stunned. Some were actually smiling, enjoying the light show themselves. For the first time in years, her loyal board members weren't following her lead. She reached for the mic again, but her voice cracked. "This is an official meeting. This is a violation," she shouted. Someone in the audience laughed loudly. Then another. And another. Her power, the thing she had built through fear and rules, was crumbling right in front of everyone. At the back of the room, he leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, watching her unravel. His plan had worked perfectly. This wasn't about yelling at the board or fighting their fines. This was about taking the power they thought they owned and turning it into something they couldn't control. And judging by the look on her face, it was working even better than he imagined. The HOA volunteers who had spent the last month walking around with clipboards, harassing neighbors over the smallest decorations, now stood near the door looking confused and uncomfortable. They had built their little empire on fear, but now, nobody looked afraid of them anymore. A neighbor in the third row raised their phone and started recording. Then another. Within seconds, half the room was filming the spectacle. The president screaming and losing control, the lights dancing across the hall, the neighbors laughing and cheering. It was all being captured. There was no covering this up. She screamed again. "Security. Someone get security." But the only security officer assigned to the event stood near the door, watching the show with a grin on his face. He didn't move. In fact, he clapped along with the others. She realized then, truly and fully, that she was alone. The lasers changed patterns again, forming the shape of a glowing star in the center of the ceiling, and the music swelled, louder and brighter. A woman near the front row, one of the quietest residents in the neighborhood, suddenly stood up and shouted, "This is what a holiday meeting should look like." The room exploded in applause. The HOA president froze. She had spent years silencing people like that woman. She ruled by rules, by threats, by making sure everyone remembered she could ruin their lives with a fine or a letter. But in that moment, all of that slipped through her fingers like sand. Nobody cared about her fines. Nobody cared about her rules. They were laughing at her. And laughter was a weapon she couldn't fight. She turned toward the board members behind her, desperate for support. "Do something," she hissed at them. but most of them wouldn't even meet her eyes. One board member leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly. Another actually gave a soft shrug. They had followed her because she had power. But what good was power when the entire room had turned against her? Near the back, Jeff gave him a quick nod. The neighbors who had helped set up the lights were grinning ear to ear. The plan had been simple. They didn't need to fight the HOA with long speeches or legal threats. They only needed to show the neighborhood what the board couldn't. Joy. The kind of joy no rule could ever erase. The president stumbled back from the podium, her voice now shaky. "This is illegal," she tried to say, but no one was listening anymore. People had stopped hearing her voice. They were too busy enjoying something they hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Even the neighbors who had always sided with the HOA sat in silence, realizing she didn't have control anymore. The president tried to pull the plug herself, storming toward the side of the stage. But as she fumbled behind the curtains, one of the neighbors, a quiet older man who had been fined 3 times that year for having non-standard garden ornaments, stepped in front of her and said calmly, "Not tonight." She froze, stunned. She had never been told no to her face. The crowd started clapping again, louder this time. It wasn't just about the lights anymore. This was something much bigger. All those years of pent-up frustration, all the little humiliations the HOA had forced on everyone. This was the moment they stopped letting it control them. It wasn't a rebellion with signs or angry speeches. It was a rebellion made of color, laughter, and light. He watched her face turn red, her voice lost beneath the music, her power evaporating. She looked small now. Not like a queen, not like a leader, just a bitter woman who realized the kingdom she ruled was nothing without fear. The show ended on its own, exactly as planned, with a soft fade-out of light and a final gentle sparkle on the ceiling. The music drifted away like the last note of a lullaby. The room was silent for a heartbeat. Then came the thunder of applause. The crowd rose to their feet, clapping and cheering as if they had just witnessed something legendary. She stood at the podium trembling, her control gone, her authority stripped away in front of everyone she thought she owned. And as he walked past her toward the door, she met his eyes for the first time that night. She didn't see a man she could intimidate anymore. She saw the person who had just dismantled everything she built with nothing but a plan, a button, and a holiday light show. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She had lost. And the best part was, she knew it. The sound of applause shook the walls of the community hall. It wasn't polite clapping. It was loud, strong, defiant. It was the sound of a neighborhood waking up after years of silence. The HOA president stood at the front of the room, gripping the edges of the podium with white knuckles, her face pale with fury. All those years she had strutted through these meetings like she was untouchable, like the entire community was under her thumb. But now, she stood there alone, surrounded by a crowd that was no longer afraid of her. The neighbors who had once bowed their heads to avoid conflict now stood tall, their eyes bright with something she hadn't seen in years, freedom. The homeowner walked slowly toward the center of the room, not needing to raise his voice or make a big scene. The entire energy of the hall had already shifted. The neighbors were no longer looking at her for leadership, they were looking at him. Not because he was some hero or loud fighter, but because he had done something no one else dared to do. He had exposed her. He had cracked the wall she had built between the board and the people. She tried to speak into the microphone, but her voice shook. This is unacceptable," she stammered, trying to regain her authority. "This display is against everything this neighborhood stands for. We have rules." A man from the audience interrupted her with a sharp laugh. "Rules? You mean your rules? Not ours." Someone else shouted, "We're done with your stupid letters." Another voice followed, louder and angrier. "You've pushed everyone around for years." The president froze. She wasn't used to being interrupted. For years, she had spoken and everyone had fallen silent. Tonight, it was different. Her words didn't matter anymore. The people she had controlled were finally talking back. One woman stood up, a quiet resident who had never once spoken at a meeting before. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew stronger with every word. "Last year, You made me take down a small Christmas wreath because it wasn't uniform. You fined me hundreds of dollars for a decoration my kids made. The crowd murmured angrily. Another neighbor stood up. You fined me for leaving my garbage bin out 1 hour late. You treated me like a criminal. Then another. And another. One by one, people stood and began telling their stories. Small acts of humiliation, petty fines, threats of legal action, fear. It poured out of them like water behind a cracked dam. The HOA president's eyes darted around wildly. She tried to bang the gavel, shouting, "Order! This is out of order." But the gavel didn't silence them anymore. Her voice was swallowed by the rising noise of a crowd that had had enough. The board members behind her sat frozen. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing the tide had turned. One of them, a man with gray hair who had always nodded along with everything she said, looked at the crowd and then quietly pushed his chair back. He didn't want to be on her side anymore. And neither did the others. The volunteers who had once marched through the neighborhood with clipboards now stood awkwardly by the walls, their smugness gone. It was written all over their faces. They knew this was the end. She turned desperately to the board, her voice breaking. Do something. But no one moved. Her power had always been an illusion. It worked because people feared it. But once that fear was gone, she was just a person with a microphone and a fake smile. And now, that smile was cracking. The homeowner stood at the front now, facing her directly, not with anger but with calm certainty. You tried to control this neighborhood, he said clearly, so everyone could hear. But all you did was make people afraid. And fear doesn't last forever. The crowd fell silent for a moment. The quiet was heavy, powerful. We all live here, he continued. We decorate our homes. We celebrate with our families. And we've spent years letting you tell us what's allowed and what isn't. But tonight, everyone here saw what happens when we stop listening to you. Someone from the back shouted, "We want new leadership." The room erupted in cheers. The president slammed the gavel again, but it was useless. She was trying to control a wave she couldn't stop. It wasn't just about holiday lights anymore. This was every fine, every threat, every smug look, every meeting where people were silenced. It was years of frustration finally exploding into the open. A neighbor stepped forward, holding a phone. "This whole thing is on video," he said loudly. "The light show. Your meltdown. Everything. People are already posting it online." Her face went even paler. She knew once that video spread, her carefully polished image would be destroyed, not just in the neighborhood but in the entire town. The man with gray hair, one of her board members, finally stood. He cleared his throat and spoke into the mic. "I've supported this board for a long time," he said slowly, "but I can't support this anymore. You've gone too far." He set his nameplate down on the table and stepped off the stage. Another board member followed. Then another. The president screamed their names, but none of them turned back. One by one, the people she counted on were leaving her side. The homeowner didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The neighborhood was speaking for itself now. The applause returned, louder than before, echoing off the walls. The HOA president looked smaller and smaller with every passing second. Her voice was nothing against the storm of her own making. In that moment, the neighborhood realized something powerful. They had always outnumbered her. They had always had the strength. They just needed someone to remind them. The president stumbled back from the podium, her control completely gone. She pushed past the crowd and stormed out of the hall, her shoes clicking sharply on the floor, but nobody followed her. Nobody begged her to stay. She had ruled this neighborhood for years, but she left it with nothing but silence behind her. He turned around to face the people. No speech, no grand gesture, just a small, quiet nod. And that was enough. The neighbors cheered, not for a man, but for themselves. For the first time in years, the community hall belonged to them, not the board, not the president. Them. The laser lights still hung softly on the walls, their colors fading like the last glow of a sunset. But their meaning stayed bright. That night wasn't just about holiday decorations. It was the night an entire neighborhood remembered it didn't need to fear anymore. It was the night the HOA lost its power, and the people took it back.